Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 59. I am the show's host, Kyle. In today's show, I am going to talk about the Putin interviews that I had watched over the weekend. Of course, these are the ones that ran on Showtime, hosted by Oliver Stone. I know there are a lot of very important current events going on, and I will catch everyone up on those on Friday. Of course, the big news being the Trump administration's threat towards Syria. Just crazy stuff going on every day, so it's really hard to step away and do a show like this. But I think this is going to be a really cool show. So I'm looking forward to putting it out there for everybody and everybody listening to it. I mean, just to start with the introduction to what this is, it's the 4 one-hour episodes of several different interviews put together by Oliver Stone and Vladimir Putin. If you haven't watched it yet, I know it's on Showtime. Check it out there. I'm guessing that you could probably find one somewhere on the internet if you're really desperate to watch it. I gotta say, it's definitely worth it if you got the time to spare. As I talked about last episode, my one and only complaint would be just that they didn't have like a translated version of it, so you had to sit there and watch it. I mean, it's good to sit there and watch it so you kind of get to see the nonverbal interactions, because there is a lot of nonverbal interactions between Putin and Oliver Stone that I think is very important, but even without that, you still learn a lot. And so if you gotta do it while mowing the lawn or washing dishes, then unless you speak Russian, I don't think you really have that option, and that kind of sucks. So I'm going to start off my analysis where the interview starts off, and that is at Putin's childhood. His dad fought in the war. They didn't talk a whole lot about his history really growing up. One of the first major events in Putin's life that gets talked about is his involvement in, I believe it was judo or jiu-jitsu, either way a form of martial arts. Putin continues to practice that martial art up until today. At one point, I think this is something that I've seen some people jump on Putin for saying, is that he no longer has a trainer come in and teach him the martial art. He just practices it on his own. Of course, the man's 60 years old, and so he was kind of saying, like, look, I don't need it. I practiced it for this long, and I'm not competing anymore, so I don't have to worry about going out there and getting my butt handed to me if I'm not very good at this. And so I don't think this was Putin necessarily being as conceited as some of the people who are looking to use this to bash Putin make it out to be. However, it definitely wasn't the most humble comment that Putin could have made. But yeah, I mean, for those people who have practiced martial arts, it does seem to play a very important role in people's lives and their general philosophy towards the world. If you're ever interested in something like this, Joe Rogan has done a ton of great commentary on what martial arts has meant to him in his life and people around him. And so if you're interested in maybe trying to, understand the Putin perspective and philosophy on the world a little bit better, one of the things you could do is take some time and understand the philosophy that martial artists have. When Putin leaves high school, he goes to college for law, and he does this for the explicit purpose of them being able to go into the KGB. Putin explains that under the USSR, you really didn't get to go into the line of work you want. You ended up in the line of work that you got picked to go into, but I guess, you kind of knew how to raid the system, and so if you want to be in the KGB, you probably had to go to school A, B, or C and be this physically active and stuff like that, and apparently Putin was able to meet those qualifications and moved into the KGB and then moved up the ranks quite a bit. As far as what happens in Putin's life during this time, a little scant on it. They talk a little bit about his marriage and his relationship to his wife. Putin has only been married once, and at one point during the interview, Oliver Stone kind of makes it sound like Putin had a second wife, but he's only been married once. Putin does have at least one child, I believe a daughter, so just something to know about him. One thing that also comes up during this part of the interview is just kind of Oliver Stone, and it comes up several times throughout the interview, but Oliver Stone asks some questions about former Russian leaders, whether it's Lenin, Stalin, Gorbachev, or Yeltsin. And for the most part, Putin is very, very diplomatic on this and really definitely doesn't speak ill of any of one. Maybe at times he's reluctant to speak positively, or his compliment of that leader is obviously not a very high praise, but it's certainly not an insult. And so Putin, throughout the interview, this is something that I noticed. He's very diplomatic. He always referred to the Americans as our partners. Even when he was talking about an event like the U.S. having a coup in Ukraine, or supporting terrorists within Russia, Putin was very saying it's unfortunate that our partners are doing this. And while that it isn't necessarily that Putin talking kindly about the United States, and I'm sure and everybody who watches it kind of gets the feeling that, he wants to say a bad word, but he's not doing it. However, he uses that restraint when you never see that from American politicians. Obviously, if Russia was arming a terrorist in the United States, or even the Iranians arming forces backed by the United States, but the United States would still force the Iran state sponsors of terrorism and violators of human rights and all this stuff. And so it's just very interesting how Putin really likes to portray himself in public, at least as a public face, as I'm a diplomat who wants to get along with people and make the world a better place. Other than maybe speaking ill of the terrorists, he really doesn't speak ill of anybody throughout this interview. If I have a note that comes up of it, I will bring it up. But for the most part, Putin very, positive. Or I guess not positive, but very reluctant to speak negatively or ill of anyone. Putin ends up leaving the KGB during, I believe, a 1991 coup. I'm not, real familiar on, the fall of the USSR or anything like that. So, my knowledge here is pretty scant, but what I could tell you is what, what's said in the interview. Putin leaves the KGB because the KGB was doing something that Putin felt was wrong, in that trying to overthrow, I believe, the leader of at the time, Yeltsin. During this time, Putin, I guess he moved to Moscow in the 80s, moved to the Kremlin area in the 80s, and then was there for years and years. Putin kind of likes to portray himself at this time as somebody who didn't have any political contacts, that he just kind of came up through the ranks because he must have been doing his job well and he didn't do anything wrong. It seems to me, just knowing how government functions, that the honest person in the room isn't necessarily the one that's going to get picked for a promotion. And so I'm guessing that Putin's time right here is probably spent more blackmailing and ass kissing and, maybe at times doing a decently good job. But at the same time, it wasn't through sheer hard work and will that Putin ends up becoming the leader of Russia, which I believe happened January 1st, 2000. Yeltsin steps down and hands Putin the reins. Putin really likes to portray himself as a reluctant leader during this time. He uses, in terms like Russia needed me, I needed to do this, this is what I needed to do. I think at times even kind of invoking a spiritual kind of, he's on his Christian quest. Putin does seem to be a pretty devout Christian, spoke about the importance of Christianity in Russia, and said it kind of replaced communism after the fall of communism. After this point, we kind of just get into some world events that had happened between between Russia and the United States, or just Russia on a world stage. One of those events is what happened in kind of the Chechenian area of Russia. I believe there's an area called South Odessa, as well as the Republic of Georgia, which is an independent state south of Russia. There have been several events, including, I believe, year-long revolutions and wars in South Russia there that require the Russian government to go in and at times kill terrorists, and at times probably kill people who weren't terrorists. Again, not an expert on this time, but the portrayal in the U.S. of these events is that this was Russian aggression trying to exert its influence on people who didn't want to be Russians. And while to some extent that may be true, there was, Putin made his point saying that the United States was arming and backing some of these, or maybe not backing, but definitely training and supporting some of these rebel groups. Of course, some of these people have ended up going and fighting for ISIS. The most famous of which was when ISIS was doing really well, taking ground, their field battle commander was a man named Omar the Chechnyan, which was somebody who was supported by the United States in his training. But like I said before, through all this never speaks ill. The United States just calls the United States our partners. He kind of regrets what the United States does, but that, it happened, and he doesn't, wants to portray himself as not holding a grudge for it, and that he's not willing to deal with America because of what happened. We get to Ukraine. He points out that the Orange Revolution, which happened early in the 21st century here, was definitely a coup, a United States bad coup, and then the 2012 coup that really went through and happened was one that was supported and organized by the United States. Putin is very factual on this issue. I've talked about it on past podcasts, and so just in the interest of time, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about the Ukraine situation. But what's important here and what we need to understand is the view of, I think Putin is expressing the view of a lot of Russians on this issue, which is that the United States was aggressor who acted out through NGOs, and there was some issues with snipers. There was a sniper team that seemed to be targeting both police and civilians in order to escalate the tensions at the Ukrainian protests at that time, and NGOs poured in a lot of outside money to try to rally a coup and protest in the area. So it's, from the Russian point of view, this was just out and out American aggression, right? With their neighbor on their doorstep. A good just way to summarize this would be a quote that was on the Colbert Report. Scott Horn likes to talk about this. I forgot who the guy was, but he was from the CFR, the Center for Foreign Relations, and he said, why Putin was over in Sochi enjoying the Olympics, we're gonna sneak away with a coup with his, girlfriend Ukraine. So for the rest of, my analysis here, it's not gonna necessarily go in chronicle order of the interviews, just because they kind of jumped from subject to subject and sometimes came back to subjects. And so the next topic I want to talk about is just general U.S.-Russian relations from the perspective of Vladimir Putin. One of the earliest events that gets talked about is the Cuban Missile Crisis. At this time, Putin's argument was that, the Cuban Missile Crisis was important and very unfortunate, but it was only a Soviet response to U.S. nukes in Turkey. Putin very knowledgeable on the events and said that, hey, this happened first and this is why Russia did what they did. And so whether this is factual or not, I don't think really matters. What's important is that we're getting it from the perspective of the Russians here. And so if you ever think of the Cuban Missile Crisis from the perspective as an American, you always think, well, those dastardly, Soviet commies put nukes right off America's coast, and the Russian response is, well, you put nukes right, on a landmass in Asia, so that's a problem for us. At one point during the interviews, I guess Oliver Stone and Putin watched at least a portion of Doctor Strangelove together. I thought it was kind of significant that Putin was willing to sit down and do it with that Oliver Stone. One of the really interesting parts of this interaction, I don't know, this is something that could be staged, and so I always try to be careful not to, be suckered in by, something like this, like a cute little story, but it wasn't very interesting to me, and that was as after Stone and Putin watched the movie, I guess Putin had somewhere to go, and Oliver Stone gave him the movie, forgot to take the DVD out of the DVD player and put it in the case and walked away. And I guess Putin actually opened it to see if the DVD was in there, and it wasn't. It went back and asked for the DVD. So it kind of seemed to suggest to me that Putin did plan to watch, the movie again or watch it later, and kind of nice thing to see. One thing that Putin does throughout the interviews is he's very respectful to other world leaders in a way. Sometimes he says, I know ISIS was shipping oil through Turkey, but he won't say what world leaders were in the room when he presented world leaders with the intelligence that this was happening. And so in a way, I think it kind of leads people to speculate that maybe Trump and Erdogan were in the room, but at the same time, nobody knows that for sure. And I guess to some extent that this is Putin showing some respect for other world leaders and not just throwing them under the bus. But he didn't give details, but he says he has made the U.S. some good deals on either military reductions or military disarmament to a little bit between the two countries, certainly nuclear disarmament. Putin says that from a Russian perspective, Russia feels encircled by the United States. Certainly, I would just do a Google image search, U.S. bases around Russia, and you can see that there are a lot of U.S. bases around Russia. Of course, there's a lot of U.S. bases all over the world, but from the perspective of Russia, there's a U.S. base on almost all their sides, and so obviously that creates a lot of fear with the Russians that, the U.S. is encircling them because they plan to, swoop in and go for a kill maybe or something like that. one of the main portions, and this was talked a lot about throughout the interviews between Stone and Putin, I think it's an issue that they both feel very passionately on, and that's the nuclear issue. One of the first things that came up is the nuclear defense missile treaties that are in place that the U.S. is withdrawing from. This is something that Putin was really unhappy to see. This basically said that both countries can't build a whole bunch of nuclear weapon interceptors. The U.S. uses the THAAD missile systems. Of course, Putin is very well versed in the history of kind of nuclear relations between the U.S. and Russia going all the way back. He understands all the treaties between the Soviet Union and the U.S. very well and why those treaties are so important, like the Missile Defense Treaty. Putin expressed that he was very concerned that the United States was moving at least closer to believing they have first strike capabilities. I've talked about this on the show quite a bit in the past, so I don't want to get into a ton of detail just about the nuances of U.S. first strike capabilities, but what Putin echoed and what I had said in the past is basically that the United States, with all these missile defenses, it gives them the at least the illusion that they could carry out a first strike against Russia. Putin said in the interview that he does not believe the American missile defenses work as well enough to stave off all Russian response to nuclear weapons, but I think Putin kind of indicates that, the idea in poker, and that is if your opponent thinks they could beat you, they're going to be willing to bet all their money, and even if they're wrong, the money is all on the table. Unfortunately, all the money in this case is setting off nuclear weapons, and so it's a lot of risk to not just Russia, but, really the whole world. Putin seems to have a very good understanding that any nuclear conflict at all would mean the destruction of humanity. I should have counted, but on several different occasions, Putin did say that, look, this would mean the end of the world if the nuclear war between the United States and Russia broke out. I think he understands the weight of that and the severity and the importance of his role in history, right? Putin has one, there's two buttons in the world that could blow up the entire world right now. Well, at least two buttons in the world right now that could blow up the entire world. And his finger is on one of them. And so that's a very heavy, it's a heavy weight. It's a heavy responsibility. It's a lot of power. And Putin seems to understand what that power means. I'm not entirely sure that either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump understood what that power means, and Donald Trump what it means now. It seems to them they could be very flippant about how they treat Russia because, we're the hegemon of the world. But Putin understands that while America may not be a hegemon, Russia has enough power to retaliate against the United States, and it can mean the destruction of the world between the two countries. Putin says at this point that Russia is just trying to keep parity with the United States, and this is very important. He brings up the ideas of mutually ensured destruction and all this that basically says the only thing that keeps the United States or Russia from not using nuclear weapons against each other is the fact that if one did, the other one will wipe out the other and, kill off everybody in the planet anyway, so who the hell cares? Why do it? And so, like I said, Putin very well versed in all this nuclear stuff. Putin, kind of made it clear that he opposes nukes, but they're a part of the world we live in today. Understands that nobody would survive a nuclear war, but is kind of unwilling to get rid of nukes because this is what we have. Kind of using the Pandora's box argument that once the box is open, it can never go back inside. And so, we could pretend that we want to disarm nuclear weapons, but I don't think Putin thinks that will happen. Other things dealing with U.S.-Russian relations is NATO expansion. Putin, from the Russian perspective, and what Putin was saying is that it's not that just that these countries are becoming allied with the United States, but that they become allied with the United States and NATO, and then U.S. troops go in their countries, then U.S. bases go in their country, U.S. weapons, U.S. nuclear weapons, U.S. missile defense systems. And so, while for the United States, signing Montenegro into NATO may just seem like, oh, we're just, protecting this little country of little consequence in Eastern Europe from Russian aggression, the reality of the situation for Russia is that Montenegro, which, has an army of 2,000, is now going to have 2,000 troops plus another 500 U.S. Marines there with some artillery and some tanks and maybe some F-35 jets. And it goes from being a country that really isn't any significance on the map to a country with a lot of significance on the map for Russia. And so every time a new country joins NATO, it's another threat towards Russia. And I think Putin kind of did say that one red line seems to be is that if Ukraine were to join NATO, it would just be too much of a threat. Another critical piece of U.S. and Russian relations under the Putin era was Ed Snowden. And so from the way Putin tells the story is that Snowden reached out to Russia and then they said, we have no opinion on it, but we're not going to harbor you here. So, go somewhere else. And while, the official story, well, not the official U.S. government story, but the official true narrative goes that Snowden was on a plane that I believe was making either a transfer or a stop in Moscow and then headed off to a Latin American country. What happened was that the United States revoked his passport while he was on that plane from China to Russia, thus stranding Edward Snowden in Russia. Once in Russia, Putin didn't give Edward Snowden to the United States, and Putin made a couple points. One is very just from a practical standpoint, and that is the U.S. refused to sign a extradition treaty with Russia. I guess there are some Russians that Russia wants back there in America, and America is saying no. And so I think from Putin's perspective, it's like, why would I give you my guy if you're not going to give us the guys we want? You always want this one-sided deal, and we're just not going to have it. Oliver Stone asked Vladimir Putin a lot of kind of personal questions just about Edward Snowden, about what he thought of Edward Snowden. Putin denies that Russia has any mass surveillance program, even though I'm pretty sure that Russia does. In fact, at one point, this is where I think Oliver Stone probably should have pushed Putin a little bit more in the interview because Putin kind of waffled on one of these mass surveillance questions. But Putin says that, Edward Snowden did a very courageous thing by standing up, that Putin wouldn't have done it himself, that if Putin was in the KGB and the KGB was doing this, Putin would have seen it as his role to tell his advisor or his superior that what was happening was wrong, but not necessarily to go out and expose it to the nation in general. And I think this has a little bit to do with kind of the nationalism that I'll talk about later on. The last thing, just U.S. and Russian relations, and that is the Iran nuclear deal. At one point, Putin's just like, you got the Iran nuclear deal, and now you still want more. This is why we can't really work with the United States at times. And so I think just from the perspective of the rest of the world, it's important for Americans to realize that the rest of the world is getting exasperated with the United States, because even when Iran makes a deal with the U.S., we still say it's not good enough and threaten Iran all the time. Want to talk about some 2016 election stuff. First, Putin said, and these were several interviews that occurred over a couple years, so throughout these interviews, Putin always said that it didn't matter who won and refused to weigh in on the election for the most part. At one point, Oliver Stone actually called Hillary Clinton a neocon, and Putin kind of laughed and agreed, and when asked about the neocon himself, Putin said very sternly, they scare me too. And so I thought it was odd that Putin used that language, because he doesn't seem like a man who would, really like ever to admit that he was intimidated by anyone. But I guess John McCain and Lindsey Graham coming over and telling the Ukrainians to go to war with Russia is enough to scare Vladimir Putin a little bit. Vladimir Putin referred to the United States as the bureaucracy that rules the world, and I think his point was kind of that while the U.S. government may have a different leader, at the end of the day, there's only, it's just the bureaucracy, and it is what it is, and it's moving in the direction it's moving. Post-election, in one of the interviews that occurred after the election, I believe it was in November 2016, Putin said that Obama was making it hard on Trump, meaning that Obama was really destroying U.S. and Russian relations. Of course, this is all in all the post-election Russia hysteria nonsense going on that we have to deal with even to this day. And Obama's putting all these sanctions on Russia for the sake of putting sanctions on Russia because the Democratic Party was sad that Hillary Clinton lost, I guess. One thing that Putin talks about during this part of the conversation is the anti-Russia bias. This is one thing that Americans have become conscious about, maybe, is that, they try to not make every bad guy in a movie either a black thug or Arab man wearing a turban, because it kind of reinforces these negative stereotypes that every Arab's a terrorist and every black person's a thug. But at the same time, the bad guys in all the action movies still have a thick Russian accent. They have a big bodyguard named Ivan that could crush, somebody's head in between their hands and all this other nonsense. And so, Putin kind of makes the point that, hey, it's because of this, kind of implicit American cultural bias against Russians that leads them to be so willing to understand this act. Now, a point that I've heard made very often, but I think it's an excellent point from Vladimir Putin, and I was pretty surprised to hear something so kind of intricate come out of his mouth. Putin also makes the point that the U.S. Did interfere in other elections, including elections in Ukraine and in Russia themselves, if not directly by the United States through the NGO proxies. And I think to this point, Putin was just kind of saying like, hey, it's a little hypocritical for the United States to suddenly start complaining about people rigging elections. One thing Putin did say that, that Russia didn't order any hacking on the United States, but he didn't seem to really care about denouncing the narrative. I think, at least to some small part, Putin sees the conflict between the American political parties as something that's good for Russia. I'm not sure if that's right. I think it could make the American government even more irrational than it is, and that could be very dangerous for Russia and the rest of the world. However, I guess if you are an opposing power and an opposing leader, I don't think you necessarily think it's a bad thing whenever you really throw a wrench within the two opposing parties. And really even within the parties, if you look at the differences in opinion on the Russiagate scandal between John McCain and Donald Trump, it is vastly, vastly different. So I think Putin is really content to sit back and let everybody squabble. I think one of the kind of the last remaining points that I've seen people make in support of the Russiagate narrative is, well, Putin really hasn't done anything to say he didn't do it, and why doesn't Russia prove they did do it? And I don't think Russia cares to prove that they didn't do it, to be quite honest. I think Russia is very content with them letting Americans squabble over something so stupid, and while it may continue to portray this anti-Russia bias and nonsense, it's really undermining the American government and creating divide within the American people. I want to touch on some of the war on terror stuff that got brought up in the interviews. One is that from the Russian perspective, Russia has been fighting terrorism Islamists longer than the Americans. Russia sees Al-Qaeda as a product of the United States through its support of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, as well as, I think, to some extent, blowback. Putin sees that America created the Al-Qaeda monster for itself. At one point, Oliver Stone asked Vladimir Putin, if Russia has been battling Islamists for so many years, why didn't it see 9/11 coming? Why didn't it warn the United States about it? And Putin's point is that, Al-Qaeda was the monster that the United States created, so they are kind of responsible for caring for it. After 9/11, I believe Vladimir Putin was actually the first world leader to contact George W. Bush to offer condolences and help in fighting the people who carried out this attack. And I mean, at this point in 2001, while NATO expansion is going on, it's nothing like what we have going on today, where there's proxy wars being fought between the United States and Russia and Syria. And so I think there was a real chance that they could help each other. Russia, to their extent, provided the U.S. with some support. It sounds like what Russia did is allow the U.S. to kind of use land routes protected by Russia and maybe some Russian bases to move some weaponry into Afghanistan. One thing that kind of stood out to me in the interview is that Putin quoted Ariel Sharon the first time they met. Apparently, Putin says Ariel Sharon told him, "You cannot trust anyone on any issue in the Middle East." Just a very interesting quote. I don't know if it's true or not, but it certainly seems accurate. Stone and Putin don't talk about Syria as much as I thought they would, but some of the interesting things that came out of the interactions between them on Syria war. One of the goals of Russia is they don't want Syria to turn out like Iraq and Libya. Russians very much understand the destruction that the U.S. has caused in the Middle East. If you look at Libya, Yemen, Afghanistan, Somalia, or Iraq, they all have very heavy American fingerprints on them, and they're worse today, especially for people like Russians, who are a lot closer to the region than the United States and have heavy Muslim with some jihadist presence in their countries already. Putin makes the point that there were a lot of terrorists, some of the US-backed ones that went from Chechnya to join ISIS, and if Putin just let ISIS run its course in Syria, Putin felt like this would lead to a lot of Russian fighters returning to Russia, and then now they're radicalized ISIS jihadists, and that causes a lot of problems. Putin emphasized the destruction of history as something that he didn't like to see. I think it's more of a personal note about Putin than anything else, but it was another reason he gave that while he wanted to continue the fight in Syria. Russia or at least Putin has, made it sound like in the interview that he's willing to let the U.S. help him fight ISIS all he wants, and that he wants to work with the U.S. in Syria, but it's the U.S. supporting Al-Qaeda and not wanting Russia to bomb Al-Qaeda, and the U.S. helping Al-Qaeda that's making it impossible for, Russia to kind of go along with the U.S. in this situation. Also, part of this was kind of the story I was talking about earlier, where Putin says that he told other world leaders and provided them with proof that ISIS oil was flowing through Turkey, but Putin wouldn't say who was in the room or what world leaders were in the room when he talked about it. I would have liked to hear more about what happened in 2013 with the whole chemical weapon stuff. As Ray McGovern likes to say, Putin pulled Obama's chestnuts out of the fire on that one. I always get a kick out of that, so just wanted to touch on that. One thing I pulled away from the interview is that Putin is definitely a Russian nationalist. Putin loves Russia. I think Putin in large part sees himself as a protector of the Russian people. Of course, Russia has a much longer history than the United States. It's just been a country for longer. Of course, when the United States came, we wiped out and destroyed the culture of the people who have been here for thousands of years, and in a lot of ways wrecked their history. Not that they wrote a lot of it down, that there wasn't a lot to destroy. It's not like a situation where they went in, they sacked a city like Rome, but at the same time, they did wipe a lot of Native American cultures off the face of the map, and so that history is lost. Where in Russia, even through the Soviet Union and whatever, all these people have always considered them Russians for at least over 1,000 years now. And Putin sees himself as a line, one in a long line of leaders that is trying to protect the Russian people. One of the things that emphasized this for me was that Putin was very distraught and said the bad part about the fall of the Soviet Union was that instantly 25 million native Russians were no longer living in Russia overnight when the Soviet Union fell. Of course, one of the policies or the practices of the Soviet era commies was that they would force migrate Russians into their satellite states in order to kind of hold more sway in those satellite states. But when the Soviet Union fell, of course, this caused a lot of problems, because now you have all these people rooted in other countries, but they don't see themselves as being Lithuanians, they see themselves as being Russians. It seemed to be emphasized again and again throughout the interview. A lot of the interviews are occurring in these very brilliant and amazing Russian buildings, a lot of gold, a lot of awesome architecture and all this stuff. Of course, I'm sure it was built on the backs of, slaves or serfs or peasants. People were probably starving while the leaders were sitting in, golden thrones, but at the same time, just seeing all of this and how I think Putin really liked showing off the riches and the splendor that Russia had to offer. There's just a couple miscellaneous things that came up that I thought were important. One, Putin was very happy to talk about debt reduction in Russia and inflation reduction in Russia. Putin seemed very content with Russia's defense spending at about $60 billion, which is less than 10% of what the United States will spend on defense next year. Putin, I think, is kind of sitting back and realizing that the shoe is on the other foot this time, and that's the American empire that's overspending, unlike what the Soviet Empire did, leading to the fall of the Soviet Union. Putin touched on homosexuality in Russia and kind of where laws in Russia stand on homosexuality. Definitely a lot more regressive than U.S. laws, but I don't think you should let anybody portray Putin as a barbarian on the homosexuality issue. He seems more like a 1990s American than anything else. He's a little uncomfortable with children being exposed to homosexuality, because he obviously is an understanding that it's a biological thing and not a, personal choice type of thing. And so he's afraid the culture will influence. He, understands the importance of culture. And other than that, seems okay with it, kind of laughs and says it's not for me. And I'm sure Putin, kind of sees himself as a big time ladies man. Very interestingly, they show Putin interacting with this female producer a couple of times, and him being like, oh, you gotta check out these beautiful monuments here or there or something. I'm not sure why they chose to include those clips, but they just very interesting to me. At one point, a kind of a common thing, a thing that ran through this was that Putin sees himself as the man who saved Russia from the oligarchs. Of course, this was true that a lot of what was owned by the USSR government now had to be privatized in Russia, and a lot of it just went to the people who were connected, so these people became very rich. Putin himself has become very rich from being in office, but then he denied that he became wealthier in any disrespectful or unbecoming ways, and Oliver Stone really didn't push him on this. It seemed to me that there might have been a little bit more there. Putin just made statements like Russia no longer sees itself as being within the Cold War. Russia is not the USSR, and that Russia is on its path to becoming a democracy. I think Putin understands that cultural changes are very important when, having a country and a society, and so he sees that that democracy can't happen overnight. Of course, it's sold to the Americans that you could go from being a Middle East, military dictatorship to being a democracy, and it just kind of doesn't work, because unless people have like a cultural love for democracy, then they're not going to respect it like they should, and it's really not going to net the results that you want. Want to finish up with a couple final thoughts. I know this show is running a little bit longer than my shows usually do, so I'm not going to try to spend too much time on this, but just a few thoughts on Putin himself. One, apparently he's the survivor of 5 assassination attempts. This is one thing that I looked up and researched a little bit about Gaddafi, and apparently that guy went a little bit more crazy and power hungry with each of the assassination attempts on his life. Of course, I'm always skeptical when leaders say they have assassination attempts against them, because it seems to be a great way to consolidate power. Putin is a very well-regulated man. Throughout the entire interviews, he was always had a very charming personality. At times, he became maybe a little bit more serious, but never less sincere sounding. At no point did he appear to me to be frailed or uncomfortable with a question. Maybe at times he danced around a question, but even then he did very confidently. Throughout the entire interview, I felt like Putin was in complete control of the interview. At times, this is from nonverbal things, like at one point they're driving around and talking, and Putin is driving the car. Putin always seems to be leading the way and deciding where they're going to meet and talk. A lot of times they're in these beautiful Russian buildings where, you're sitting in the throne room, and so whenever you're sitting in the throne room with the leader of a country, that seems to just add to the power disparity between the two people. Oliver Stone wasn't necessarily submissive to Putin, but he was just never very challenging. I think Putin has a very healthy and realistic fear of the nuclear weapon situation in the world today, and sees himself as a disadvantage, but understanding of the consequences of a nuclear war between the two countries, and that's something that is a positive, I think, that comes out of it. Like I said, Putin absolutely loves Russia, and values Russia maybe above anything else. I think at points, Putin seemed to light up a little bit more when talking about his successes in Russia, even maybe more so than his, I believe, daughter graduating college or granddaughter graduating college. Putin had kind of an opportunity from Oliver Stone to kind of say how happy he was to have that happen, and he didn't do it. He just kind of yeah, it happened. Overview of the whole interview. First of all, so important. Even if you look at it and you say, all this is crap, understanding how the other side thinks and feels is very important. I think in a lot of ways, judging by Putin's poll numbers in Russia, that his views are really reflective of the Russian people. So if you want to understand what at least a very large, maybe plurality of Russians think, then I would check this out. I would say that I don't think Oliver Stone pushed back against Putin enough. I think he could have challenged him at times a little bit more. I think it would have made for a more interesting interview, and maybe would have gave a little bit more credibility to his interview as well. And number one takeaway from the entire interview was just that Putin was always in control of himself, in control of the interview, that he always just seemed to have that command of everything. And so, very interesting. Very much worth watching. Those are all my thoughts on it. I'm not going to get into too much else on this show. I'll be back on Friday to talk about current events. If you like the show, please share the show. You find the show at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. You find my Facebook page, Kyle's Files, or the private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. My personal blog is kylesfilesblog.com, and I'm a blogger at the Libertarian Institute. Thanks, everyone.